Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.
Today we're going to be talking about your battery and workouts that require your battery. We're going to go over essentially what a heavier workout and how we pace that. Quite often when we talk about battery style workouts, and most commonly people can associate those heavier Metcons. Very recently, the Open just had 20.4, so we can talk a little bit about that. Todd, do you want to define what a battery is, or or what we're talking about today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've mentioned this concept a few times in different podcasts, but just as a refresher, the idea is that people have different amounts of time that they need to recover between challenging efforts. So if we think about in a typical CrossFit Metcon with an increasing weight barbell ladder that we see regularly in things like the Open or various qualifier workouts, you'll see people who are able to do repetitions at some absurd percentage of their 1 rep max, right? 80, 85, 90 plus percent. And they're able to do 1 repetition every 20 seconds, or 1 repetition every 30 seconds, or 1 repetition every minute at extremely high percentages of their actual maximum potential, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense from sort of a traditional strength and conditioning, protocol relative to how many reps you can do at certain percentages. But what these people are able to do is they're essentially able to recharge the battery, quote unquote, to do a challenging lift more quickly than other people. So the idea of battery is what percentage of your max can you repeat on short rest? And as you improve your battery, you're able to do potentially higher percentages of your max, and you're able to potentially reduce the amount of time between those repetitions. So that's just what we mean from like a theoretical backroom perspective in terms of battery. And Luke, like you mentioned, the sort of standard example of that is something like 20.4, where we had clean and jerks at increasing weight throughout. And for some people, the second barbell was heavy. For some people, the third barbell was heavy. For some people, the fifth barbell was heavy. But essentially, most people had at least some point where it was like, wow, this weight is very heavy. And their battery sort of dictated how quickly they were able to do those repeated reps under pre-existing fatigue and potentially make it through the workout.
So if we're essentially looking at sort of something very similar to strength endurance, and I think that one of the key things as well is people's ability to actually like maintain good technique whilst being under fatigued as well. So what ends up happening quite a lot is you'll have people who are essentially just they're not able to hold those positions as well when they are fatigued. So once they are under a little bit of metabolic stress, then you notice that there's certain things that take a little bit more time and effort and focus, that these things start to go away. How can we train someone's battery, and what are the sort of ways that we can sort of develop this pacing? And I mean, a lot of people do just associate the idea of getting stronger through just absolute strength, and that allows them to be more proficient at workouts that require heavy repeatable work, because it's quite a simplistic way of thinking about it. It does make sense if someone is fairly sort of new to this a initial increase in absolute strength will help them, but we're seeing people who aren't necessarily reaching time caps, and they might be 2 bars away from the absolute max clean and jerk, using 20.4 as an example. So, what are the sort of combinations of movements that we can use? What can we do in terms of structures of workouts? How can we train this?
Yeah, Luke, I think that your point is pretty important, that increasing your absolute strength and improving your battery are pretty loosely coupled the more advanced that you get. Like you mentioned, for people who are brand new or who are potentially just not even strong enough to move any of the barbells that they want to move at all, that actually getting stronger will, for those individuals, potentially improve their capacity in that kind of workout. And also for people who kind of naturally have an excellent battery, that increasing their strength will potentially improve their capacity on that type of workout, because sort of no matter where their absolute strength is relative to their, nature and physiology as an individual, they're always going to be able to access pretty much anything under the curve of their absolute strength in almost any scenario. But for a lot of folks, if you do get stronger, it doesn't necessarily mean that your repeatability at a specific weight is going to change. So I think that there's a few layers to thinking about what we want to work on to improve that, right? One is simply, the EMOM type of work, or the interval-based barbell work, where we do 1 rep every 15 seconds or 1 rep every 20 seconds, or 3 touch and go cleans on the minute, and then on alternating minutes do a certain amount of assault bike effort. Something like that is sort of like standard battery-based training. But the reality is that the battery is affected by the overall ability of the individual to sort of transport oxygen around their body in order to resynthesize the substrates necessary to do those challenging high effort pieces, right? So people who have a great battery tend to be much better at delivering oxygen throughout the body so that they can sort of recover quickly between those difficult efforts. So it's a combination of both wanting to train that specific trait of battery itself, as well as improve the overall aerobic capacity of the individual, and not just their aerobic capacity, but their ability to actually move oxygen in their blood when they're doing something that's sort of like mixed and messed up and nasty and requires them to do burpees and then something different, and then double unders, then something different, and then a heavy barbell. Because it's one thing to be able to go from, let's say, rowing or ski erg into something like that. It's another thing to be able to go from a mixed piece where you're doing all kinds of different stuff and actually hitting muscle endurance fatigue into that type of situation as well.
Do you think that do you think it's important that people are looking at, say, if they're looking at this from long term, they are potentially like prioritizing that aerobic development so that they can then essentially just increase the ceiling for them to perform more direct, challenging pieces of training, which are going to actually improve it. So it could be, I mean, off the top of my head, I'm just thinking of workouts you've given me, Todd, like the 500 meter easy row into like 5 moderate to tough power cleans, and going through 5 rounds of that, and then essentially starting out with something like that and then developing it into something that's going to be a little bit more, okay, now I'm going to alternate between tough assault bike and touch and go power cleans.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great example of something that, using a cyclical piece like the 500 meter row at moderate effort creates some sort of aerobic fatigue leading into a challenging barbell based piece. But the type of fatigue from rowing, like we mentioned a second ago, is different than the type of fatigue from burpees and dumbbell thrusters, right? And so you want to think about creating a theoretical progression for that individual of saying, hey, can you actually do these tough power cleans after rowing at a moderate effort? Great, you can. Can you do these tough power cleans after rowing at a high effort? Great, you can. Can you do these tough power cleans after doing burpees with no push-up and light wall balls? Great, you can. Now can you do these tough power cleans after doing thrusters and chest to bar at a challenging effort? Oh, you can't do that. Okay, great. We sort of know where you sit on that development. So I think it's a matter of developing all these different traits kind of in isolation, let's say, like the aerobic capacity and the strength, et cetera, but then making sure that there's some sort of plan to actually integrate those pieces together and figure out how to create those varied scenarios of fatigue such that we're challenging that individual's ability to recharge their battery appropriately for where they are in their development as an athlete in the sport.
Yeah, it makes sense. What would you say, just going off, not necessarily off topic a little bit, but like, I know we've mentioned things like enemy and people's just ability to, for instance, the neuromuscular efficiency, and I know that those people who are more explosive athletes, potentially like the heavier, more challenging efforts, just creates a little bit more sort of perceived stress on the body, which actually prevents them from being able to make those repeated efforts. And then you obviously have those people who are a little bit more enduring, who might actually be a little bit more well suited to battery pieces, so that the essentially the perceived stress going through those heavy efforts isn't as high, so therefore they're actually able to go into the next rep and not necessarily feel as challenged in doing that. Do you think that's a big part in that's obviously going to be a big consideration, but like how would we train people who are potentially more explosive and find those situations more challenging, and then how would we train those individuals who are potentially not as explosive and find it a bit easier?
Yeah, I think that you're bringing up some good points there. And I think anyone who has either coached athletes or is an athlete themselves sort of understands that some people kind of hit like a maximum fatigue point more easily than others when doing things related to heavy battery, right? And typically we can think about the standard overly explosive athlete who can jump on a huge box and power clean all kinds of weight, and then as soon as you give them something where they have to do any of that stuff out of breath, they completely fall apart, right? So the way that those individuals fatigue seems to be a little bit different, and I think that I was mentioning some of the stuff about oxygen transport throughout the body. And I think Evan Pycon from Training Think Tank has done some really interesting work with actually tracking that with some high-level athletes training on site at Training Think Tank and seeing the differences in terms of how those athletes are able to utilize oxygen in different muscles. And I think that is probably a more relevant fatigue mechanism than sort of the more like old school Poliquin thinking regarding neuromuscular efficiency. But I do think that there is also some sort of top-down change in the way that athletes experience fatigue, right? That you sort of get this peripheral fatigue from the lack of oxygen in the musculature, which then creates challenges the ability to create contractions because there's not enough oxygen to kind of clear substrate and actually like create contraction. And based upon that, then you have this peripheral fatigue, which then triggers some sort of central fatigue, which then triggers some sort of global inhibitory response that makes you just feel terrible, right? So I think the more explosive athletes often tend to have that happen to them. So the trick is, how do you train these individuals in a way that you're progressing their ability without pushing them past that threshold where they just completely blow up? And for those folks, it's really easy for them to blow up. And it's also not always clear when that's going to happen, right? That they'll have a few really good sets and they're feeling really good. Then all of a sudden something is just a little bit too hard and then it's just over, right? They're completely done for the day because they, had to grind the squat on one squat clean. And it's just like, well, you're done now. That's it. Whereas other folks are able to just keep kind of grinding and keep moving. And for those people, you have to be much less careful in terms of what you give them for training because they can just kind of do a lot of different stuff and feel good with it and not hit those massive fatigue points. So it's much easier to train those people because you just kind of give them hard shit to do and they get better at it. I don't know if that actually answered your question, but
well, yeah. On that point, Todd, how much of that do you think is actually is actually related to their level of experience as an athlete and knowing what situation or what feeling likely leads to that point of fatigue and no way back?
I think that's huge, right? I think for the more explosive athletes, that having a ton of experience does facilitate them being able to navigate that critical drop-off point much more effectively. Right? Because they are aware that, hey, I'm the type of athlete who can completely fall apart if I do something that's a little bit too hard or if I go a little bit too early. So that ideally those people have a very finely developed intuition for when it's okay for them to go or not go based upon how they're feeling, what they've done before, how fast can they actually hold a pace on an assault bike in order to go into something and have capacity, even though it potentially feels good on the bike, that they're aware that like, you know what? It feels good for me to go 69 RPM right now, but I know exactly what's going to happen to me if I do that and then try to go into heavy snatches, right? Whereas other athletes may be able to just kind of have I'm going to get after it. I'm going to push hard and I'm going to sort of see what happens because they don't have that same just like massive critical drop off if they go a little bit too fast. So I do think experience is crucial for those athletes, but I don't think it can necessarily whatever, change their physiology or their tendency, because they'll probably always have to be battling that.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that a lot of people start to they try to do is they just try to implement, for instance, workouts that are just heavy so that they can develop that experience, and they can sort of go this sort of almost brute force method where it's just about throwing so many different combinations at themselves so that they actually know how to deal with those situations where sort of that isolation into sort of integration and understanding the themes of how certain movements and certain combinations and certain modalities might actually affect your battery, quote unquote, or like how you're actually operating with those heavier weights under fatigue. I think I remember watching, I think it was like one of the really old videos, a sort of a day in the life of 1 and 2, and it was sort of going over Graham Holmberg's training, and I think he was talking about how he basically just throws out so many different combinations, does as many different couplets and triplets as he can, so he has that understanding of how they relate to each other. And I think that that is almost someone or people involved in sort of competitive CrossFit sort of almost have this sort of feeling of doing the same thing or trying the same thing, and it just sometimes it ends up they end up, like we discussed in previous podcasts, actually developing like compensation patterns in their pacing, and it's not actually just it's not a good long-term route, and it's probably just going to cause them to stop at some point. So what we've spoken briefly about developing like long-term sort of progression through, developing aerobic fitness, and then slowly and gradually integrating more intensity. But what are the types of things we're looking for in terms of pacing and trying to develop pacing for people, and giving them like some little more actionable cues or actionable points for approaching their training and training pieces like this?
Yeah, John, I mean, you mentioned that experience is key for athletes to be able to kind of navigate this. So how do you try to give experience to athletes in their training that teaches them how they should be thinking about their battery?
For people who I know struggle with it, I'll set them a lot of pieces that maybe like EMOMs or every 30 seconds or, lifting on repeat, partly as this is going to be good practice to kind of improve, and partly as this is going to teach you where your limits are, and this is going to show you that you're going to hit a drop-off point at certain loading or at certain on certain time cycles. So I could give someone who say has a max clean and jerk of, let's say, 300 pounds. And I know that if I give that person repeating 275 on a 30-second clock, they're going to be fine. If I give it to them on a 20-second clock, they're going to blow up. So we'll kind of flirt with that line of maybe we go on a 20-second clock, but we make it 265 and get them comfortable with that loading and that repeating. Or maybe we give them 25 seconds on a 275 bar to allow them to kind of develop that capacity and practice specific situations with that loading.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's worth mentioning on that as well is that if you watch high-level athletes perform battery-style workouts with heavy barbells, that they often end up falling into very consistent timing in terms of their lifts. That if you go back and watch some of the 20.4 announcement videos, you can see Ben Smith hitting 1 rep every 10 seconds with a certain barbell, right? Increasing the weight, then it's 1 rep every 20 seconds, increasing the weight, then it's 1 rep every 35 seconds or something like that. I don't remember the exact times, but I don't know that he's specifically watching the clock, and I don't think he is, but he just has, John, like you mentioned, that intuition for how different weights are going to affect him and what his rest time needs to be. And it ends up just being so rhythmic and just like clockwork, where it's like, boom, as soon as the barbell hits the ground, if you watch the clock, you just see, okay, the barbell is going to hit the ground again in 10 seconds because he's going to take 2 breaths and then pick it up, and it's going to just be on this exact cycle.
And I think that was particularly obvious with the elite athletes in 20.4. because the other movements in the workout for them didn't really affect the workout. You know, the pistols and the jumps or step ups, however people chose to do them, they weren't affecting the clean and jerk that much. For the people that knew they could finish the workout and had that maximum strength to be able to move the final bar, it was really all about how well could they repeat the barbell. That was what the workout was made up of.
Yeah, like I think.
Yeah. So go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, that workout was like people had time, so they had to just make sure that they were preserving themselves as best as they could to get to that challenging weight. And and then when times runs out. Obviously, we're seeing people in the elite category, especially on the women's side, doing the workout in like less than 75% of the time cap, like, and just absolutely destroying it. And that was one thing I was gonna bring up. So obviously, I know that sometimes the weights in the open workouts are a little bit off in terms of I don't know if they're using a 70% or 66% percentage for men and women, and I know a lot of it does come down to sort of like changing barbells and things like that. But traditionally, we see women doing better on workouts that are more battery based and based off of just men being more explosive and not necessarily actually having just higher maxes. Is that something that we can see that women do better at in competitive situations than men, especially on the elite side?
I mean, I would argue that the weights in 20.4, and it was the same loading as 19.2, whatever it was, the total bar clean.
Yeah, the toaster bar one. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was the same loading there, but the top weight relative to elite women's maxes was lower than when compared to men's. And whether or not that's just because the system they're using to decide what the men's and women's weights are is not like accurate, or they're overlooking something, or whether it's because women are better with battery pieces, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, if you use the standard scaling ratio, a 315 barbell should be more like 225. So, right. I mean, I think that accounts for the massive difference that we see in times, for sure.
But like, I mean, generally, generally speaking, men are more explosive than women are through certain like strength pieces like that. And like, I think that women can handle higher volume closer to their max in training, and this is what I've actually found. So like, easy example where something might be sort of so it might be like a 3x5 for a high-end male athlete. Women, I've found, can do probably 5 sets of 5, and they actually are able to tolerate volume a lot better. Do you think that that's something that could it be seen in battery style pieces? I mean, there's something I've noticed personally in training, and I've heard other people talk about as well, and other coaches talk about. But have you guys seen anything like that?
Yeah, I think that there's anyone who's paid attention to this has probably anecdotally seen that more of their female athletes tend to be better at battery style training than their male athletes. But I think that that's one of those tricky things, like any sort of large group based distinctions, where there may be variations between the groups, meaning that on average, women tend to have this ability to do this percentage of their 1 rep max. And on average, men tend to have this ability to do this percentage of their 1 rep max. But that the variation between individuals is still much greater than the group variation, right? So that it's difficult to say, oh, well, you're a female, so you're going to be good at battery, so this is what we need to do. That there's plenty of women who are not, and there's plenty of men who are. So I think it's much more important to just be aware of where each individual sits, but that as a coach, if you're working with multiple athletes over time, you might sort of notice a trend and be like, oh, interesting. It seems like based upon the sample of athletes who I have, that more female athletes are good at this than men. And I think that's kind of interesting, but I don't think it necessarily has a ton of practical application for coaches or athletes, because again, I can think of plenty of women and plenty of men who are, wildly all over the place. And that variation between those individuals just completely outstrips the group differences.
Yeah, I suppose it's tricky as well if like you are playing around with essentially giving a certain group something that might be a little bit more than the quote unquote dose response to try to, adapt to group differences as opposed to just operating based off the individual. But yeah.
Yeah. What about the actual, I guess, testing process here, right? Because we're thinking about this battery piece as a key part of a lot of testing that's going to show up. And Luke, like you mentioned, a lot of athletes want to get stronger to potentially make themselves better at CrossFit as a sport. But I think if we look at the testing, testing suite as a whole, meaning just the different types of tests that we see, that maximum strength is very rarely tested, but that this battery type of situation is tested all the time. So how do we think about how athletes should be training relative to the tests that are going to show up?
Well, I think that I think it's probably a test all three of us have done. The sort of like max power clean and an 8-minute AMRAP at 90%. Like I think that, I know that's sort of one of the OPEX battery testers. I think that's a useful test, but I think that if you potentially try to simulate the different structures that might come up in a CrossFit workout, and we typically see heavier weights, and it could be, for instance, testing a max of some sorts, and then creating maybe like a subset of different percentages based off of that, and then having X amount of say, just off the top of my head, it could be, okay, I'm going to do 30 power cleans at 40%, 30 power cleans at 60%, 30 power cleans or something along those lines at 80%. I know that's I've written variations of that workout, but I think something where you are you're first of all establishing something that's going to be heavy, so that we have like an idea of, okay, what can we work with, and then we can potentially create percentages based off of that, and rep schemes based off of that to simulate a CrossFit workout. Something like, I think it was at 12.2 with so 12.2. I think that's a great test.
And that was just the escalating weight snatch ladder, correct?
Yeah. So I think that something like that
is like 30 snatches at lightweight, 30 snatches at moderate weight, 30 snatches at moderately heavy weight, AMRAP snatches at heavy weight in 10 minutes. Yeah, like I think something like that is probably going to be a little bit more, that's going to be typically found in CrossFit. But yeah, obviously it needs to be leading up to something that is heavy, and that the athlete, or like however you are creating the workout, like you actually need the opportunity to get to that heavier bar. So if you're doing all of this work prior to it, and it's fairly lightweight but higher volume, you still need to be actually, like, the athlete needs to be able to work through that and be confident in working through that, so that then when they get to that heavier bar, that's when they start to have to really dig deep and work and figure out, okay, what's my strategy going to be here, and then you can sort of basically see what people are made of in those situations. Yeah, what do we think for very specific tangible takeaways that people should think about in their training, right? If they're concerned with their battery, like, okay, you convinced me this is something I should be worried about. I'm not just going to throw some dumb weightlifting cycle on top of my CrossFit training to get better at this. What should I actually do?
I think first and foremost, you need to look at whether it's actually just like something that's movement based. So if this is something that keeps on cropping up, okay, we take weightlifting for example. If it happens on both workouts with snatches and also cleans and shoulders overhead and whether it's squat cleans, whatever, if it happens all of these movements, then you can probably say that this is more of an issue. But if it's something that is happening maybe with just one movement, it could be something technical. So I think that's probably going to be your first.
Well, and Luke, let me interrupt you real quick on that, because I think that's a really interesting point as well, is that as people fatigue, they're going to have a hard time accessing certain musculature because, like we talked about before, it's just simply not able to keep doing work, which is then going to result in compensatory patterns, right? So you may have technical issues that pop up as you fatigue, and it's not necessarily because you don't know how to do the technique. It's because certain muscle groups are completely shot, so you have to do some crazy compensatory stuff to even attempt to lift the weight. So then your technique turns into a disaster, and then you can't do it.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like you see it quite often with essentially people not bracing correctly and not getting into good positions of tension when going through heavy deadlifts under fatigue, and they sort of just start to break at the midline and Jefferson curl the weight up. But yeah, I think that first off, you'd look at it whether it's a movement-based issue. If it is a movement-based issue, and you're basically creating something that's some more compensatory technique because of something is getting fatigued in isolation, it could be about actually working on that. But generally, I think that what was it we were saying? Mine's gone blank. What was the second thing?
Well, podcast is ruined.
Let's just start again.
Yeah.
Start again.
Start over. Start over.
Fuck, I had a good point then.
I highly doubt that. Don't worry.
Yeah, I don't know. I literally just gone blank. Let's cut this one out. Todd, come up with another, or John, come up with another tangible outcome.
Yeah.
Let's leave that in. I like this. Let's leave it in. I think for a lot of people, testing is important to know where they fall short, and to know what situations are the issue for them. So Luke, what you were saying there about, is it technique on a lift that's breaking down at a certain fatigue or load? But also just knowing what loads are the issue for you, what percentages of your max start to become an issue when you try and cycle or repeat weights. Because like we said, knowing what it is, and being able to understand that in a workout is important. But you need to do it in testing. You need to do it in training to figure those numbers out. And then you can start working on improving. But if you don't know what the issue is and you don't know where you start to break down, it's harder to actually train for that.
Yeah, and on that point, I think that for a lot of people, improving this is going to be less about having some sort of clever strength cycle and more about doing intelligent battery-based work that is at a level of sustainability for them that they can then attempt to progress, like we talked about, potentially either in various interval-based barbell scenarios or layering in different types of fatigue going into interval-based barbell scenarios. And then also, honestly, just improving your overall capacity to take in and deliver oxygen is probably going to be more effective than doing whatever 3x3 snatch at 82%, then block snatch at whatever percent, then snatch pulls. That for a lot of folks, provided they're strong enough to play at the certain barbell that they want to play at, like a weightlifting cycle isn't going to help. It's a different physiological phenomenon that needs to be trained.
Yeah, and I think that you can look at it very specifically with movements, and you can train certain scenarios. Whether you're doing a 10 minutes of touch and go barbell work, that's going to be relatively heavy, and you're looking at that as being more specific. But then you can look into things that are just generally very just hard efforts, whether it could be doing sled drags or sled pushes and just general things like that, which take a lot of effort, but they just don't necessarily have as much breakdown on the body as going through touch and go barbell cycling. So it's trying to almost get the same feel and get the same stimulus from something else that might not necessarily be as directly correlated to competition. So we're not seeing sled pushes coming up I'm just using that as an example. We're not seeing sled pushes coming up in the open, but we obviously know what it feels like when you're trying to push a very, very heavy sled and it's not really moving, and you might not necessarily be as metabolically fatigued. That could be something similar to, going through the 225 bar or the 225 and the, I think it's 175, 145.
What did you say, Luke? Carry on.
Yeah, on 20.4. So yeah, I think that you can be hyper specific about it, and that's probably where people are going to first go. But then I think that maybe actually just generally training, and if you are going to be planning something out, look at it a longer term development as opposed to 6 weeks to repeat 20.4 and smash my score. It's probably not going to work as well as people want it to.
And one thing I think is worth mentioning as well, as much as we're talking about battery here, it may be that people just need to get stronger. There are people out there who were doing 20.4 and they got to the 205 or 315 bar and they couldn't lift it. And it's not because their battery sucks. It's just because that's above their max and they actually just can't lift it yet. So as much as, doing battery work and testing and everything's important, if you don't have your maximal strength to be able to move that bar, then that's still an important part as well.
Yeah, and to give a tangible example of that, we have an athlete at South Loop who made it through the 275 bar, and his max clean and jerk, I think, is 285, right? So it's like, that's an athlete that, if you think about that, you're like, that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. How did he clean and jerk 275 5 times after doing all that other stuff? And it's 10 pounds under his max. Like, if that athlete gets stronger, he's probably going to be better at that workout. But that's so far in that extreme direction. So just be aware that that's the archetype of athlete for whom that is a relevant thing to think about. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.